Okay, so we're going to start up today with a discussion of fluxes. Fluxes is the next topic that we're going to cover. And we're going to start off, as is often the case, with the way to make fluxes, or a way to make fluxes, which will be the so-called factory method operators. So we're going to start off by talking about factory method operators that create flux streams in various ways. And here we're going to look at the just, fromArray, fromIterable, and from operators. So there's a gaggle of them that we're going to look at. So what is the just operator? Just as with monos, where we used just to make a mono from a non-reactive source, so too can we use just for flux to create a given element or elements and then complete. And the main difference between mono and flux, as we'll see, is that they're going to be a varargs list of parameters you can pass into here. So you can pass in one or many parameters, and those will be used to create the flux stream. And it basically works, again, much like mono. It returns a new flux that's captured at so-called instantiation time. In other words, it's eager. It's done at the time when you give the values, not at the time when it starts to run. And again, unlike mono's just operator, multiple elements can be emitted, where mono can just have one element. No big surprise there, because mono is for one thing, flux is for many things. The purpose of this operator most commonly is to adapt so-called non-reactive input sources into the reactive model. So here you can see we're going to create a flux stream that consists of 4 big fraction objects, and those objects are going to be having the numerator of 100 and then different denominators, 3, 4, 2, 1, and so on. And we'll look at this in more detail when we get to the case study here. Again, it's evaluated eagerly at assembly time. Therefore, it always runs in the thread where the assembly is performed, which may not be the same thread where the actual computation takes place at runtime. And keep this in mind when we talk later about the subscribe on operator and how it affects flux streams. And you'll see it basically has the same semantics that mono's subscribe on operator does, in that eagerly evaluated methods like just or fromIterable, which we'll talk about, or fromArray, which we'll talk about, those are all evaluated eagerly in the thread in which they're assembled, as opposed to the thread in which the actual call is running at execution time, which would be for lazy operators. We'll talk about lazy operators too. RxJava has a just method in its observable class that's very similar to the one you get with, in fact, it's really pretty much identical to the one you get with Project Reactor's Flux. So it'll create a stream of observable stream. All of these things are also very similar to the stream of factor method that we have from Java streams. You can say stream.of and give it basically a varargs list. So here we're going to create a stream of 4 big fraction objects, just exactly the same way that we could use just, or that we would use of just for either flux or observable. So just is the simplest one. Now let's talk about fromIterable. FromIterable is actually a very useful factor method as well. It creates a flux that emits the items that are contained in the iterable that's passed as a parameter. So we pass in an iterable. If you recall, an iterable is basically kind of the root of an iterator in Java, and you can use this for things that you can iterate over, like lists being a good example. And this is a bit of a discursion, but the iterate method on the iterable will be invoked at least once and at most twice for each subscriber. And I won't go into all the reasons why it works that particular way, but it's semantic. This doesn't really matter most of the time, except if you build your own iterators, you have to be prepared for the iterator method to get called more than once. This is also a factor method operator that adapts non-reactive input sources into the reactive model, most often using Java collections like lists or sets. So here's a very simple example where we've got a list of integers, and we just say flux.fromIterable, give it the list, and boom, you've now got a flux of iterables, which you can then do stuff with. You have a stream of these things that you can manipulate with other operators that we'll talk about shortly, like map or filter or whatever. RxJava also has a fromIterable method that works exactly the same, so no big surprise there. These are also very similar to the stream method that you have on collections, like on a list. So here's a very similar example of what we're doing with RxJava or Project Reactor. We make a list of integers, and then we take that list and we say stream, and that turns it into a Java stream, and then you can do map and filter and other things on that stream. So this should all look very familiar, nothing too surprising here. Next method is fromArray. As you might expect, what it does is it creates a flux that will emit the items that are in the built-in array that's passed as a parameter. That's where the data comes from, and it gives back a flux that will emit the items in the array. Once again, this is starting to get a little repetitive, but that's just the way things work with some of the factory methods. This allows you to be able to adapt non-reactive input, like built-in arrays, into the reactive model. So here's a very simple example where we have ourselves a built-in array with some values in it, and then we create a flux from that array. And we'll look at that example in the context of the case study here coming up shortly. There's a fromArray method in RxJava's observable that works exactly the same way. And this is also very similar to the of method that is used in Java streams, as we saw. So if you have a built-in array, you can use of on it, and it will turn that into a Java stream. There's also yet another way of doing this with Java. You can use the arrays utility class and the stream method, so you can give it an array and it'll convert that into a stream. So again, just sort of n variations on the same theme. The final method here that we're going to talk about is called from, and it's a little bit different than the three we talked about. So it's a little different from just, it's a little bit different from fromIterable, it's a little bit different from fromArray. So from takes a publisher, which provides the source that we're going to be using to create the flux from, and it returns a new flux that decorates the source at runtime. So in other words, unlike the other three methods we've talked about, fromIterable, fromArray, and just, from is lazy, and it will run in the thread in which it's actually going to be invoked in, using something like subscribe on. Here's a way to use this. This is actually kind of a workaround for a weird quirk with fluxes and Project Reactor. This is going to go ahead and create a flux that contains a single big fraction object that's obtained from a mono. So you can see here we're going to call make big fraction. Make big fraction is called from mono.fromCallable, which is a lazy operator, and therefore that will be done in a lazy way. So every time it gets called, for example, when different subscribers might join this particular flux, then we would get a different big fraction made randomly, and flux.from perpetuates that dynamic laziness. And therefore, every time this publisher is called, it'll potentially return a different value. In this case, it will, because it's a random number generator. But that gives you a feeling for how you can deal with this stuff. This idiom I'm showing you here makes up for Flux's lack of a fromCallable method. RxJava's observable has a fromCallable method that is lazy. For some strange reason, there's no fromCallable method that exists directly with Project Reactor's Flux, so here's a way to get the same effect. It's a bit more verbose, but it works. And you can see RxJava's fromCallable is very similar to from, except it works on callables as opposed to publishers, but it's basically the same kind of idea. All right, so that's the end of the factory methods. No real surprises here. A lot of these things look a bit like what you would expect to see with mono. We've got a just method. We've got a from method that can be used in a somewhat similar manner to fromCallable, especially if you combine it with mono's fromCallable. And then we've got a couple of other methods, fromIterable and fromArray, that are factor methods that are used to create a flux of something, which contains multiple elements typically, as opposed to a single thing, which is what you get, which is all that you get with monos.